So we have 25 people so far. Welcome. I'm going. Okay.
Hi, if you just joined, we're just going to hang on another minute or two to make sure everyone has a chance to log on. Just imagine you're entering into the museum auditorium and you're greeting old friends. Good afternoon. If you just logged on, we're going to keep it going one more minute and then we will start the program. Thank you. Okay, I think we will start. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's program, Voting Rights and the 19th Amendment. I'm Judy Margles. I'm the director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. We're really delighted to be hosting this program with the Oregon Historical Society. And I certainly hope that everyone who's isolating at home is staying healthy. Both OJM-CHE and OHS have nimbly adapted to the virtual world with a variety of programming, and I really urge you to look at our websites or sign up for our e-blast to see all of our forthcoming events. We're also really glad to be offering these programs without charge, so I do want to ask if you have the capacity to make a small donation to support these programs and ensure that we can keep them up going forward. Please know our gratitude in advance. Both of us on our websites have big, large donate buttons, so thank you for that. It's really with great pleasure that I'm going to turn the program over to my friend and colleague, Eliza Canty-Jones. Eliza is the Director of Community Engagement and the editor of the Oregon Historical Quarterly at the Oregon Historical Quarterly at the Oregon Historical Society. See, I can't even speak anymore in my isolation. So welcome, Eliza. Eliza's going to introduce our wonderful panelists and moderate the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judy. And I mix those two up all the time, so no worries. It's wonderful to see the number showing so many of you here today. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and then I have some questions, but just to make sure folks know, there are two little icons down at the bottom of your screen. One says Q&A and one says chat. I think you can use either of those to enter in your own questions, and I'll be working to keep track of those and pass your questions to our panelists today. So please don't be shy. Feel free to use those, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So Janice Dilg is the principal of History Built. It's a historical consulting firm. She's also the curator of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education's core exhibition, Discrimination and Resistance, an Oregon Primer. She is an oral historian and a public historian who has conducted many projects, including for clients such as Oregon State University and the U.S. District Court of Oregon Historical Society. She was also a co-founder of the Oregon Women's History Consortium. Kimberly Jensen is professor of history and gender studies at Western Oregon University. She was also a co-founder and is a board member of the Oregon Women's History Consortium. She's authored several books. One of my favorites is Oregon's Doctor to the World, which is a biography of Esther Clayson Poe Lovejoy. And I can't help but say that Kim also served as guest editor on the fall 2012 Women in Citizenship special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. So welcome to both of you. Thanks for being here. I'm about to ask you your first question, so unmute. We wanted to open the program today by talking some about your work as women's historians and to ask you how you think about that work. How is race a central part of this history that you research and analyze and present to other scholars and to the public? How do you think about women's individual complex identities? How does that show up in your work? And if you would say a few words also about what your intention is as scholars focused on women's history. So, to you.
Jan, would you like for me to start?
Sure.
I'm happy to do that. I'm delighted to have this invitation. I suppose that one of the founding things about my work as a women's historian is that I identify as a woman, and I, as a young person, had questions about women in the past. And in my ongoing work, especially as I've engaged in work around World War I and gender issues in the early 20th century, my students especially have urged me to consider broader questions and more diverse questions about women, because they're also asking about their identities, and they're coming to terms with who they are. And in terms of gender, this means that we all have complicated identities. So I feel that it's my responsibility to ask questions about diverse people in the past, to also now build a gender non-binary approach so that I can understand identity. And so I think my philosophy of looking at the past is constantly evolving. But one of the things that I think is very important is that we have to understand that whose lives have been documented means that there are privileged individuals whose histories have been well documented. And it's an adventure to go through the records and to try to identify the lives of individuals who are not people of privilege or who have not been considered people whose lives should be documented. And so that quest and making sure to really follow every trail is something that I'm also very committed to.
Well, thanks to OJM CHE and OHS for organizing this event, and to all of you for taking time to come. I would say suffrage is actually a topic that was my first introduction to race in women's history and race among women suffragists. And so I think for me, the fact that we're never talking about a monolithic women has always been central to my work and interests and research. And I think particularly in some of my early work, it became clear that working women are often less documented, and working women, non-white working women and ethnic women, tend to filter out even more. And so I think having that orientation early on has kept me looking broader and deeper to find those voices, because that really is an important part of the history that we're trying to tell, whether it's suffrage or minimum wage history or progressive era. All of those factors come into play. And so I think the suffrage centennial is really a way that's been highlighting some of those discrepancies and allowing us opportunities to really bring all these multiple voices forward.
I'd like to ask you both to speak some more about what that work entails. I mean, I think there may be many of us here who are familiar with the ways that racism or sexism or heteronormativity, to use a nice big multisyllabic word, have influenced what's documented, what's in the archives, what kinds of records have been kept by institutions like the Oregon Historical Society. So when you're talking about these lives of folks who have been documented less, how do you find these women? How do you find these people, and how do you use what you've got to access those stories? And what are the challenges?
Jan, do you want to go first?
Sure. You know, I think some of our work has been made easier in recent years by the massive digitization of collections. So particularly now, when we can't go anywhere, there's still a certain amount of access online. And I would give a particular shout out to Historic Oregon Newspapers Project, because by digitizing smaller towns and cities and ethnic and racial newspapers, for example, The Advocate, has really given us much easier access to documenting Black women suffragists in Oregon, for example. And so, you know, having those tools have made it, to some extent, a little easier to add those voices to the record than we might have had previously. And quite honestly, the Centennial has brought out a lot of scholarship nationally about the racism in the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement, and ways, and who were some of the women, Black women, who were overcoming that, and who were some of the working class groups that formed. We have a great example here in Oregon with Esther Pohl Lovejoy and the Everybody's Equal Suffrage League. That was not repeated often around the country, and really brought working class women into the Oregon story, and many of those women remained active in the national story. So I think it's really taking those first little nuggets, which might be nothing more than a name, and using that name to search those online US Census records, newspaper records. And it is painstaking and it is time consuming to sort of build those stories pretty much from that one detail, but it's worth it. And we know a lot more now, even than we did in 2012 when we were documenting Oregon suffrage history.
I'd like to echo what Jan says. When I studied Esther Pohl Lovejoy, she was someone who was an intentional archivist. She realized that the history of women doctors would not be kept by anyone else. And so she urged her colleagues, and she herself kept those records. So in her case, there was documentation, and she also was intentional about documenting women of color and women transnationally. So that was important. So there have been women who have kept their histories, and we're grateful for that. Right now, I'm doing a lot of studying of the troublemakers, or people who were considered troublemakers. And so their lives appear. The women who were designated as enemy aliens during World War I had to register with lots of information. So there are ethical questions. Do I, as a historian, use the products of a surveillance state to learn more about them? I've come to the decision that with care I can. Women whose civil liberties are challenged by being sent to the Oregon State Hospital and potentially being vulnerable to eugenic sterilization. There are careful ways that we can be ethical in using their stories without intruding, I think. And so there are many, many ways that these kinds of records, employment records, records of strikes, but my work has always centered on newspapers, because what women did was considered remarkable or odd or interesting by some, but also newspapers were the social media of the time. And so you could put an advertisement for your suffrage meeting in the paper. You could put who spoke, you could put who was attending. And lots of those newspapers have long lists of attendees. So we need to be creative. We need to think about, how did people get information in their own day? And I would echo Jan, the newspaper digitization is revolutionary for women of color, and for people who were not documented in other cases. So thank you to the University of Oregon and to all the other digitization programs. And I tell my students, it's very true. Once you start with that, you better say to your friends and family that you won't see them for a while, because it's so empowering and it's so fascinating to see what was happening there.
Thank you. I'm always in awe of the tenacious work that historians and researchers do. I am not cut out for that, and I am grateful for all that you all do to put in the time. We have a question from the audience about influences, and the question has to do with Howard Zinn being one of the pioneers in examining history from a point of view other than that of the ruling class. And I'm thinking that question is making me think some folks may have seen in an interview over the past week or so, Attorney General William Barr said, well, history is written by the winners, so we'll see how our administration is judged, depending. And I wonder if you would both speak to that a little bit. Some of who are your influences, Zinn or otherwise, in how you think about that idea of the ruling classes and the winners, and who gets to write history and how. And particularly, you know, as you've been talking about the history of women's suffrage and women with varieties of different kinds of identities that may not be right there on the surface of documentation. How do you get at that, and who's done it really well?
Why don't you start, Kim?
I will be happy to start. I had the great privilege of studying with Linda Kerber, who asked this question: was the American Revolution truly revolutionary? And if so, did it reach everyone? And of course, in the great questions of challenging authority, there were winners. They were wealthy white men, and then everyone else. Especially that slavery remained, racism remained, and discrimination by gender remained. And so she took a very large category that historians had thought about as central, of course, and do think of as central to our history, and ask these kinds of questions about it. I've also been influenced by Ellen Carroll Du Bois, who in her own writing started out thinking about suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and then came to realize that the real story was the coalition building, the nuts and bolts, the diverse women across ethnic and racial and class groups that really did the work of suffrage. And so in her own work, she continued to ask those questions and rewrote that history. And I think that's a very powerful example. And those two, I think, would be two that have influenced me. I would also say that I came to the study of history at a time of social history where most historians were asking the question from the bottom up. How was history written? And so that's just been my training and my inclination. And I think about the very powerful historians of race and ethnicity, the historians who are asking us and inviting us to question gender itself as a category of historical analysis and to build a much broader non-binary history. So those are things I think are important in the way that I try to approach it.
For me, one of the first nonfiction, historical accounts that I read, even before I trained as a historian, was the life of Martha Ballard, who was a midwife, by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. And she had found records that existed in archives that male and probably female historians had just overlooked because it wasn't the type of person that people considered important or interesting. And, it turned out to open up this whole different aspect of early colonial America. And I think that just inspired me to wonder what records exist that no one's paying attention to, that maybe some of that material is there, and to keep going in that direction. And, you know, by the time I was studying history, I think kind of the new Western history ideas were in place, and there had been some early history of women in the West by Sue Armitage, and I'm forgetting Betsy's last name. Help me out, Kim.
It's Jameson.
Yes, thank you, Betsy Jameson. And, you know, so there was this percolation going on about thinking about regions, gender, non-binary, you know, all kinds of ways, including different ethnic groups, when thinking about opening of the West, or, you know, westward, you know, movement and all of that. And so I think I was lucky enough to come when some of that foundational work had already been done, and I could build on that.
Let me add as well that I think Jan exemplifies another very important area of inquiry that's empowering, and that's oral history. And the theory and practice of oral history is, at its base, the idea that everyone's story matters, and that especially the stories that have not been documented are of value. And I want to say that I think one of the oral histories that my students have appreciated the most is Amelia Valencia Canisteria, and she is a woman who was deported during the 1930s as a Mexican American. And so that resonates with my students. The generosity that she engaged in to conduct that is, you know, just an example of many, many people. And Jen knows this better than anyone because of her broad work with oral histories. And so the practice of history has as its base these basic questions. Who do we want to hear from? Whose stories matter? And it's really important, I think, that not only in digitization, but to also be active in gathering those stories through oral history is really important. So a shout out to Dan and oral historians.
Thank you. I would like to make one more pitch too. You know, Kim's talked about Lovejoy being an archivist of her own work. And so I always like to encourage audiences that I'm speaking in front of to think about, what have you been involved in? What papers do you have that you should be thinking about donating to an archive for, you know, those historians 50, 100 years down the line who are looking for material about this era. Your work's important too.
And just one more brief thing. So a couple of years ago, I started seeing references to a Black women's newspaper in Portland, the Peoples Bulletin, our Peoples Bulletin. It was published every week by the Black Women's Council. Where was it? And so far, we have one copy from June of 1917. It's at the University of Santa Barbara. Thank you, the University of Santa Barbara. And it was part of someone's estate collection. So it is so important that if you have an inkling of any papers that might be at your fingertips or the fingertips of your extended family, that these could be treasures. This might be a box that is up in a crawl space. It might be something else, but we continue to find new things all the time. So digitization reveals, but also the generous folks who go through the papers or who ask questions about what might be in those boxes. It can make an incredible difference in what we know and who we know about.
Thank you. Don't assume your things are not worthwhile. Take it to an archivist. We have so many wonderful questions. Thank you, audience, and keep them coming. There are two questions that are sort of related, so I'm going to combine them. And one has to do with an interest in knowing if you're thinking differently about voting rights as you're isolating due to the pandemic. And then also in this moment, what is your purpose and aim in highlighting women's suffrage? I think those are nicely combined, if you can be presentist for the moment.
Well, I want to urge everyone, if you haven't filled out your census, also to fill it out and make sure at least 10 of your friends have filled it out too, because we use that all the time, and that's very much tied up with voting. I think I've been thinking a lot about who wanted the vote, who didn't want the vote, who wanted the vote and didn't get it, didn't have access to it. I think one of the things that I've been trying to highlight since 2012 is the vote in 1912 in Oregon and the vote in 1920 nationally, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, did not extend voting rights to every woman. And we need to be critically aware of that and think about that as we think about how voting and voter suppression is happening today and what that looks like. And maybe it doesn't look like what we think. So in 1912, the words in the Oregon Constitution removed white male, but it didn't add unnaturalized Asian American women or men, Native women or men, with few exceptions. And really that didn't turn around until, in some cases, technically in the 1920s, but maybe realistically not until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And so I think we need to be honest with ourselves about who's voting, who's not, and why not.
Well said. I have been thinking a lot about 2020, and I think about the beautiful exhibit that is at OHS that we aren't seeing right now. And I've been thinking about that a lot because so much work went into that by wonderful, wonderful people, two of whom are here with me. And they're not silenced there. We're not seeing them right now, but their voices and their actions and their important work is something that we will be able to see, but also we've documented this in other ways. And so finding the time now to study this topic is a powerful antidote to our isolation. I believe that. I also believe so very strongly that we need to think about what we know today to be true, that power and privilege mean that not everyone has the same access to voting and to other elements of power and belonging in our society. And often a pandemic, a crisis, lays bare those searing differences between people. And so if we can go back with this in mind, with a purpose to say, who worked for the vote or who worked to empower themselves? And then once achieved, what did they want to do? Most of the people that I've studied wanted to change their communities in some way after achieving the vote, after getting this power, whether it was teachers getting tenure or being able to stay married after they married as teachers, whether it was having jury service, or the civil liberties, especially around World War II, the safety in one's person, the right not to be incarcerated if you have a sexually transmitted infection, the importance of healthy communities, the importance of getting legislation passed, lobbying efforts to do that. And indeed, there were many women who wanted prohibition, and this was one of the first results of the vote. So we see today that there are many ways that we want to make our vote change society for the better, make our communities stronger and healthier. And we want to, I think that might help us identify with the diverse people that we're studying in this centenary. So thinking back to that. Also, I always think it's very important that we complicate our history to realize that once something has been achieved, it's vulnerable and can be lost.
Yeah, Kim, I've had the benefit of hearing you speak publicly about any number of perspectives on this history for many years, and I've always appreciated that emphasis on not taking any of this for granted and not assuming that that the progress narrative is inevitable, that we're just simply progressing toward greater equality. And I feel that very strongly now. So thanks for always pointing that out. I have, I don't want to lose this. There's a question, Kim, about the oral history that you mentioned that's so powerful for your students. And if you could state that name again, I think it's Amelia. And
So yes, and it is in Sue Armitage and Laurie Mercier's collection, Speaking History. And it is Amelia Castaneda. And she is actually, unless in the last few weeks she's passed, she's still alive. And also I want to recommend that her on-camera interview is in the PBS, the Latino Americans, in the segment. It's about a 15 or 20 minute interview. It's one of the most moving interviews you'll ever see in your life.
Thank you for that. And then there's a quick factual question that has to do with whether there was territorial suffrage for women in Oregon as there was in some other Western states. And I think this is a good opportunity to just elaborate a little bit on what kinds of voting rights women had when in Oregon. One of you could speak to that.
Jan can help fill in my gaps when I forget. Oregon women before 1912 were empowered in school elections from the 1870s. The idea was that women were concerned with children. Initially, they had to be taxpayers and part of school districts. And so that was one of the opening wedges, if you will, in movement. We have information about a couple of cities that offered municipal or city voting during city elections. But the 5 times before 1912 and then 1912 brought voting rights to women in Oregon. And so there was not, to my knowledge, a territorial voting. It's interesting, and if you'll go to the Oregon Women's History Consortium, there's a map of the kinds of voting rights that women had before the 19th Amendment. And some states had that you could only vote for president, or that women could only vote for president, or that eligible women could only vote in certain kinds of elections. But in 1912, Oregon women achieved the right to vote in all elections from, city all the way up to the president. Now, they couldn't vote in 1912, so the first presidential election in which they engaged in voting was 1916. But 2 women were elected to the Oregon State Legislature right away, during that first session after suffrage. So women exercised the right to vote, and then many, many women initially in November and December of 1912 started voting in city elections. There were a whole host of elections. There were sometimes 7 or 8 elections per year. And I'm trying to look through all of this, and I won't bore you with any more details. But so one of the things that happened in 1914 to 1916 was to have permanent voter registration. And this was in the long term progressive, but in the short term, especially for groups that were marginalized, there was a fear that it got all confusing. And so this is where Black women organized voter registration drives to make sure that their votes and their ballots would still be counted in this kind of confusing time when this permanent registration was happening.
And I'll just make a plug for folks who may not be familiar. The Oregon Encyclopedia is online at oregonencyclopedia.org, and both of our panelists have written some really fantastic entries there that can help you delve more deeply into some of this history. And I'm thinking of one that Kim wrote on Lizzie Weeks, who was engaged in so much of that voter registration drive, so you can learn some more about that. We have a question about the impact of the 1918 pandemic on the suffrage movement, and thinking in particular about the ways that Women were engaged in public health advocacy and professional work. And I'm interested in that question. And also if you could both speak a little bit more broadly about the context of the early 20th century and how the suffrage movement fit into that. And that's work that you both have engaged in quite extensively. So if you could speak to that some, that would be great.
Well, to start with the pandemic, you know, by this time, there was becoming much more activity on the national front for a constitutional amendment. The focus was shifting less on state suffrage and more on a national amendment. And so the pandemic did have an effect. Some of the leading national suffragists like Carrie Chapman Catt became very ill with the flu and was kind of out of the movement for a few months while she recovered. And there are news articles talking about whether the suffragists should mask up when they're out picketing and, you know, out having public events. And so it slowed the progress some, I think, for the better part of a year. But it also allowed a bit more of an in. There was kind of less noise going on around the issue. And so the suffragists did more intensive lobbying of members of Congress. And, you know, to some extent, the 19th Amendment finally came to fruition and went out to the states for ratification. But I think, you know, the landscape, this was, you know, clearly the meat of the progressive era. And so there were all kinds of reforms going on at the time. You know, Kim's touched a little bit on some of that, but one area that I've worked on is there were more women in the workforce in a variety of new occupations. And so that was causing particular consternation about the industrialization of the workforce and the workplace. And so women, particularly in Oregon, became involved in a minimum wage campaign right on the heels of women gaining the vote in 1913. And so Oregon legislators were paying attention to this new voting bloc of women that, you know, when they were considering this minimum wage legislation in early 1913, you know, how are women going to respond to this and maybe affect their reelection or the community around them? And so women were definitely immediately engaged in the political process once they had the right to vote, running for office, as Kim has mentioned, you know, as well as working on these other social reform issues.
Yeah, those are great points. And just a couple of brief additions. Eliza, get your crook when you need me to stop. But I think it's important to really recognize that Oregon was a leader in the idea that government should be more responsive to the people. Now, leaders weren't always thinking of the people in the same way and not always in equitable ways. But the Oregon system that we have as a result with the initiative process, the initiative was a huge thing for the National Suffrage Association, and Oregon was one of the first states to implement it, so 1902, and it's really that early 20th century where you can get something on the ballot if you have enough signatures from voters from the last election rather than going through various legislative means. And so votes for women is a part of the Oregon system, but also women's suffrage is a product of those kinds of reforms that went national. The structure, the question then is, you know, what is the role of a democracy in an industrializing nation? And Jan's wonderful work on that is that Oregon had a lot of answers to that, or many Oregon voters did. In terms of public health, Esther Lovejoy wrote, after Oregon women achieved the vote, she wrote to responding to a question about why she was a suffragist. And she said, first, because it was the right thing to do. And second, because she had learned that women needed the vote to be able to change their communities. And she drew on her experience as public health officer in Portland in 1907. Plague threatened the Pacific Rim. She was able to mobilize the public and the city council using the social media of the time, newspapers, to mobilize and get the city council to support eradication efforts, and there was no case of plague. She also believed in science and so did not scapegoat the Chinese American community. But even with all of that, she said it was men's business. This was about the business of Portland. The bottom line could be defined that way. And when women wanted to have pure milk and wanted to save children who were being exposed and who were falling ill and dying, including her own son, that this was women's business and they could not get that same kind of action. And so they needed the vote for that clout. And that was something that she took, and others like her took, into the public health movement and to the global transnational medical humanitarian relief efforts. Because after the pandemic, it was clear that not only is public health important, but we have to look transnationally. We have to see this as a global question. And so when Lovejoy transformed the wartime World War I era American women's hospitals into medical relief organization where doctors would liaise with local physicians and with local folks, it was also to empower women in their communities. This was during refugee crisis, the Greco-Turkish civil wars, during other famines and other crises, the Japanese Tokyo earthquake of 1923 and beyond. So public health and the empowerment of women and voting as part of that was something that many women who were involved in healthcare, nurses, physicians, and others, and policymakers really combined, I think, effectively around the pandemic and after.
Thank you. We have a great question prompted by the television show that's been out for a few weeks now called Mrs. America, that folks may have seen. That it's about the fight over the ERA, and it profiles Gloria Steinem and Phyllis Schlafly and Shirley Chisholm and other real feminist. Did I just call Phyllis Schlafly a feminist? Well, we can talk about it. But women leaders of that era. And I think, the question has to do with, if you were there and you've watched this show, you might wonder where they went for their information. And I think that is an interesting question because it as public scholars, you both are always engaged in getting people interested in this history, getting them good information. What is the role of historical fiction, and how is it useful and dangerous in women's history? And if you want to speak specifically about Mrs. America, if you've watched it, please do. Cate Blanchett can do no wrong. So.
Well, I haven't watched it yet because I don't have that streaming service, but I might have to. I've actually been a little enmeshed in the anti-suffragists in Oregon right now. And so I've actually been thinking about those two oppositional groups and how they were in the same time period, but coming away with very different ideas of what needed to happen and how they put their political energy to work. None of them have had a primetime show made, so I don't know how their factual details might be portrayed. But the fact that these anti-suffragists existed then, who, probably, from what I've read of some of the reviews and stories about Mrs. America, some of their arguments were not that dissimilar. About, women didn't really belong in the political arena, and, women should be at home taking care of business, and, the vote wasn't necessarily going to change anything. So I think, I'm not sure I have a complete answer about the value of historical fiction. But there's some basis, I think, in factual history.
This is a conversation that we often have in classes of mine, because some of my students have come to become scholars of history because they encountered historical fiction either on screen or through reading. And I will never, discount something that brings people to our table, the historian's table, right? But I think that the challenge is that we are often looking at I'll use popular film as an example. Popular film is designed to make money. Popular film is designed to reflect certain questions of the day. And so there are few that satisfy. And so I think, I guess my solution would be that there should be 13th grade, and it should be all about this. It should be all about the contradictions between what these really interesting things are, and then in empowering people with the skills to really do this. And I think the great thing to do would be to, if people are seeing this, is to do some additional reading. Phyllis Schlafly is not the first, as Jan points out, to embrace the contradiction, to say that women should not be involved in politics, but to be involved in politics, and to be full of those contradictions. So the series, I think, is attracting some interest, but also the series has some, as the person who asked me the question, that there are some serious historical problems with that, and that's kind of the nature of it. And I think to embrace those contradictions and hope to do that. Would I assign that for a class? No, but I would hope that if students had seen it, that we could then look at the readings that we're doing, for example, on Phyllis Schlafly in a gender issues class, which we do.
Thank you both so much for taking that question. One of the audience members has smartly asked a question specifically about a recent OHQ article, so how can I not ask that one? And so this article was on Clara Colby, who was a leader in the 1906 suffrage movement here in Oregon. And in the article, it mentions that the suffrage leaders understood that when a person voted, would indicate where their ballot was in the ballot box and would give some indication of class. And so that based on that, those suffrage leaders understood that working class seemed to have been more supportive of women's suffrage in 1906. And so this audience member is thinking about the ability of women to participate more formally in an industrialized economy and contribute to family finances that may have prompted working class men to vote in favor of women's suffrage, or was it some other group of factors, or can we say even? So that might not be too fair a question if you're not very familiar with the details, but I think you can take it. Yeah.
Go, Kim.
I think the 1906 campaign is very complicated. And we can only understand it in that way. I think that there definitely are working class men who are supporters, and that was certainly true across the campaigns. I don't know that we can know exactly from the order of the ballots. I think that there may be some anecdotal evidence to suggest that. But remember, Oregon was in the throes of questions of how can we be part of an industrializing nation when we have 14-hour days, and this is Jan's wonderful work has shown the way on this. And so that's certainly one very important part of that. I think 1906 is also significant because it really opened up the use of popular culture and to mass audiences with various parades, with lots of advertising. So the opening up of this campaign to the people at large and to those who are not necessarily privileged folk. And so Oregonians of color, Oregonians who were part of the working class, definitely had, there was new energy around that. So I think there are lots of things that point to saying that working class men did have a strong role in 1906.
I think that covers it.
Excellent. So I've got, we're almost at the end of our hour, and I've got a couple of sort of big picture questions for us to close out with. So the first one has to do with your work as historians working in the topic of feminist history. What are the roadblocks that you have faced in pursuing this work? And have they been moved out of the way? Is it getting any easier now than it was when you started this?
I hope it's always hard, because I hope that people will say, we really wish that you had done this, or as you're thinking about your next steps, please think more about this group. Please think about my grandmother. Please think about my community. That's not hard, that's rewarding. And it really takes the, I think it's really important to have a philosophy that you're never finished, and that you can always ask lots more questions, and you can use the resources and the sources that we have in very creative ways. I hope to be doing this for 100 more years, and I hope that I'm always asking more and more questions and trying to be even more inclusive.
Well, to build off what Kim just said, I think there is a broader range of interest in what's the feminist perspective on history, and how is that influencing, whether it's Oregon history or national history. I think there's been the discussion since kind of women's history started, whether separating that was a good thing to do or not. I know all of us have often talked about, that women's history is just history, it's Oregon history. And so I think there's more view towards that, but I think, as always, there's some pushback to that. And I think we're seeing a fair amount of that today, when, some very conservative pundits talk about, the downhill slide in democracy began when women gained the right to vote in 1920. That means there's still people and belief systems out there that don't see history as being inclusive, as that it's anything other than the winners. But I think that is what inspires me, is to keep saying, no, it actually is everyone. That all those stories together are what our history is, and what should be told, and what's really going to result in better citizens.
Just to add very quickly, studying women's history and the history of gender or gender identity is radical. It challenges constructions of power. That's the whole reason for it. And so when we get pushback, it's a good thing. We're making a difference. We're calling to question those assumptions, and we're calling power dynamics into question. So we must expect it, and we must take strength from the fact that if we're getting that, we're doing the right thing. We're asking the right questions.
Hear, hear.
Hooray. I really appreciate that. I want the last question. We have someone who's asked, in the spirit of memory activism, what do you think is the most important lesson from our past to help inform our future? How can history show us the way right now? So what is something that you want to make sure people take away from their study of the history of women's suffrage and the women's suffrage movement and voting rights more broadly?
I would say we have to hold two things. One, we have to understand the accomplishments, the work, the successful activism and coalition building and troublemaking. And on the other, we have to understand that there were barriers, there was continuing discrimination within the movement and across movements There were many battles. There were discouraging times. There were setbacks. But we have to hold both of those. We can't minimize either one.
And I would add that I think we always need to be looking to ourselves and to our near surroundings. I think one thing I find is it's often easy for people to say over there or that group did or didn't do something important or did heinous things. And I think the more I look deeply and learn more about history, you know, those instances of discrimination, of suppression, of exclusion, you know, happened here in Oregon, in Portland, or wherever you are. And so look close to home at what was going on here, and you know, don't get too big of a head about being, you know, a progressive place or a liberal place, because it's probably not quite that. And having that honest take, I think, is going to serve us all as a good lesson.
Thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to just go in all kinds of directions with us. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience. There were many good questions that we weren't able to get to, so I love that there's so much interest. Please do spend some time exploring on the Oregon Encyclopedia. There are also amazing resources on the OJMCHE website. OHS educator Sarah Anderson has written brilliant curriculum to accompany the Nevertheless They Persisted exhibit, and we'll have that up on our website in the next couple of weeks. It'll be of interest to everyone, even educators. And we are seeking ways to create some way of accessing some of the content that is safely behind closed doors in the exhibit right now, but we've already extended the exhibit, and we'll make sure it's available with plenty of time for people to see it once it's safe to do that again. OJMCHE has been recording this program, so if you want to come back to it or share it with other folks, you will have the opportunity to do that. It'll be posted on their website, and we'll try and put it up on the OHS website as well. Just want to say how grateful that I am and all of us at OHS are for the leadership of Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education and the way that they pursue their mission in our city and in our state. We're all the better for it. And also so much just for the brilliance and the hard work that Jan Dilg and Kimberly Jensen have put into their research and their scholarship, and all of the work that you do to engage public in this important history. I couldn't be more grateful for the two of you. So thank you for taking the time to do this today. We'll see you all at the next one. And we're going to now end the broadcast portion and ask the panelists to hang tight with us for just a few minutes after we end the broadcast. So goodbye, everyone. Stay home, stay safe, wear your masks, wash your hands, etc. So thank you very much.